Welcome to Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, where we talk about gospel insights through great stories, and maybe in this case, mediocre stories, and help you find entertainment that is both true and beautiful. Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree is part of the Public Square Media network of podcasts that seek to bring an LDS perspective into the public square. I'm Carl Cranny, your host today. I have a PhD in religion and have written on the intersection of religious themes in pop culture. And joining me is, of course, my co-host, Liz.
Hi, everybody. I'm Liz Busby. I am a graduate student in English at BYU, a writer of many genres, and a Latter-day Saint, of course.
Yeah. And joining us today for the first time is Jasmin. Jasmin, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jasmin. I'm a social media creator at Scripture Central, and I'm also overseeing the marketing at that nonprofit organization.
Fantastic. Glad to have you aboard. Today, we'll be talking about Heretic, a horror film about two sister missionaries whose investigator turns out to be a psychopath. It's directed by Scott Beck and Brian Woods, who also wrote it. It stars Hugh Grant as a creepy Reddit atheist and two actresses who are both former Latter-day Saints as Sister Paxton and Sister Barnes. But first, our Best Books segment, where we each recommend one thing that we are watching, reading, or listening to. I have been recently watching Masters of the Air. It's an Apple TV show done by Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, who of course did Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan and The Pacific. This is a hobby horse of the two of them to go back and show what it was like to be these various soldiers, different parts, different theaters in World War II. And this one doesn't quite reach the heights of Band of Brothers or The Pacific or Saving Private Ryan, but I've still been enjoying it quite a bit. And that's on Apple TV+. Just as a point, I'd like to say that I finally finished Star Trek Discovery a couple weeks ago, and I'm glad they put that show out of its misery. Go watch Strange New Worlds. It's amazing. Star Trek Discovery. All right. I'm glad you're gone. Anyway. Liz, what have you been watching, reading, or listening to?
That reminded me that I've also been watching Star Trek Lower Decks, because that show's hilarious, and I'm sad that they're ending it. Some adult humor in there, though. I'm in the midst of grad school. Can't really recommend the books that I'm reading. They're okay, but nobody's going to read them for fun. We just finished reading The Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross, and that is long and obscure. For fun, I've been watching Great British Baking Show. I love how they timed the new season to come out with Thanksgiving. It just feels like fall to me. Highly recommend.
My wife watches the Great British Baking Show, and it always baffles me because I think, a good cook. But baking involves chemistry and stuff, and it just amazes me. These people are like, oh, I'm just going to whip up a cake using these random ingredients. Anyway, it's very fun to watch. I enjoy it, and I am in awe of all of those people.
So that's why I love it, is because I minored in chemistry.
Oh.
It is my happy place.
It's a very soothing show, for sure. The stakes are high, but it's still very relaxing somehow.
It's so wholesome. It's someone messes up and somebody who's finished early just goes over and helps their competitor on the show. It's bizarre and amazing.
But it's maybe the difference between British reality television and American reality television.
I'll take it.
Yeah, maybe not to our credit as a culture. Jasmin, what have you been watching, reading, or listening to that you'd like to plug for our audience?
Well, it's not terribly interesting. What I've mostly been watching these days is Bluey and Daniel Tiger. But what I've been reading for fun is some Rick Riordan books. I'm reading The Red Pyramid right now. I missed the hype when those were really big. And so I've been going back this last year, and I read like the Percy Jackson series and the Heroes of Olympus. And now I'm going through the Kane Chronicles. And they're just good, wholesome fun. It's just a fun adventure, and I've quite loved getting into them.
Excellent. We will have links to all these recommendations on our website, popcultureapricottree.com. Buying through these links helps support our podcast so we can keep bringing you conversations about the true and beautiful in pop culture. And now on to our main discussion of Heretic. I'll go first. My basic thesis of my analysis of the movie is that they made a good movie by accident. I don't think they intended to, but it ends up that just the way the entire thing comes together and who the bad guy is and what his point of view is and who the survivors are. Full spoilers ahead, everybody. So soldier on. If you haven't seen it, go watch it and then come back. It ends up being a movie that turns out to be surprisingly positive towards religion in a completely accidental way. And so it's one that I at least can get behind. Maybe get behind is too strong of a term, but I enjoyed it. And I also thought that Hugh Grant was absolutely mesmerizing. If you're going to have someone spouting Reddit-style atheism, like that level of intellectual rigor at you, get someone like Hugh Grant, because at least it'll be interesting to watch then, because he's very good. But I'm curious to have your reactions to the movie, because Liz, you just sent me a text. You're like, well, that was something that I watched. I'm like, well, yes, it was. Let's get your reaction, though.
So I think the movie was much more intentional than you're giving it credit for. I'm not a horror person, as we've said before on other horror episodes, but I thought this was fairly well done. I think they intended the message to be that the horror is not atheism. The horror is the Gish Gallop. The horror is people who dedicated a lot of their time to try to tear down the faith of other people. And that Hugh Grant is basically the CES letter made into a person. Only whitewashed with general atheism. He's just asking questions. He's just informing them about ideas. But it highlights the way that our discourse around religion is poisoned by this ulterior motive. There's no actual genuine connection. We're just trying to control you and to force you to believe what we believe. And it's to their credit that they didn't show that from the religious point of view, because people make that argument about missionaries all the time, right? We go out and we want you to believe like us, and if you don't, you're wrong. And so you could make a movie from that perspective. Like Brendan Sanderson wrote Elantris, the villain is an evil missionary whose job is to convert everyone by hook or by crook. So you can write that movie, but they wrote it from the other side, and I think that's significant. It was horror. I'm not going to watch it again, but it was not too far past your basic serial killer episode of CSI. Like, it went a little bit to the horror side of that, but it wasn't so much more than that I felt like I regret watching it. So it worked for me.
No, right. Interesting. Jasmin, what were your some high-level thoughts? And I should say before you start talking, Jasmin and the team at Scripture Central put out a very good sort of response that if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of the actual religious arguments that are presented and the sort of counterpunches that go back and forth between these two sister missionaries and Mr. Reed, their investigator slash psychopath slash serial killer, that video from Scripture Central is very good at hitting sort of the high-level, these are where the bullet points come from that are then mixed together in the script of this movie. So I'd highly recommend that.
Well, thanks. Fun thing to put together, because we're just diving into the weeds and try to figure out, okay, what is the argument they're presenting? How accurate is this? Are the misrepresentations here? Or did they do a decent job considering the artistic license they were trying to take? So that's really like the perspective I was coming from when I was watching this film, is with like a fact check, analytical mind. So it was maybe harder for me to approach the film with just clean, fresh eyes and how it came across as a film. And I am not typically a horror fan myself, and so I'm not the target audience necessarily. I did not really enjoy it as a film. And the more I've been trying to follow the discourse online and specifically learn more about the filmmakers' intentions and the filmmakers' purposes in all of this and how they perceive faith and how they perceive Mormons or members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the more I'm convinced they were trying to be intentional, certainly, but they weren't very informed about it. And their choices may have been more of happy accidents than intentional brilliance, as maybe I might agree with you a little bit more, Carl. Like I said, I'm not necessarily a film critic. I'm not necessarily a horror expert. But what I do spend a lot of time thinking and studying about is how Latter-day Saints are being portrayed in the media and what the conversation online with that is. And so that's really where my head's been in all of this. But it was interesting. And as far as its portrayal of Latter-day Saints, one interesting thing is that these missionaries weren't as caricatured as missionaries have been in past portrayals. They're still playing into some stereotypes, but they weren't as bad as I've seen before.
Okay, but I had not heard about one thing that they did get correct. Did you guys notice when the title card comes up on the screen that it had it written in the Deseret alphabet below?
No.
Oh, I must have missed that. That's kind of clever. Yeah.
That is a deep cut. A deep cut.
Wow. How interesting. Yeah, I have to say, with the exception of the first 90 seconds of the movie, And I gotta say, if you're gonna go see this and you haven't yet, just be 2 minutes late.
Yeah, just go get popcorn during the first 90 seconds.
The entire first discussion between the two sister missionaries about condoms and genitalia of her brother-in-law and the fact that she has seen an amateur pornography film. If you just cut that first 2 minutes out, I think the movie goes up an entire grade for me. It goes from a C to a B. I don't know what it was doing there. I don't understand. It didn't seem to serve any other future purpose. It didn't tie into anything else that happened in the movie. It was just there. And I was watching the first 2 minutes going, do I need to leave? This is ridiculous. The rest of the movie, on its artistic merits, I thought was at least worth watching once. But that first 2 minutes.
Yeah, that one was hard for me to even understand what they were trying to do there, because clearly they were trying to subvert expectations in some way, since most people, even if they have a surface level understanding of Latter-day Saints, would know that this would be a very odd conversation to have. And it feels so out of character for a missionary couple to be talking about this. And I've seen reactions online. Oh, of course, Mormon missionaries have locker room talk just like anyone else. And yeah, that's true. But the dynamic between a companionship on a mission is slightly different than just your buddies. And the content of what they were talking about, confessing to watching pornography and how that strengthened their testimony, seemed very outlandish to me and did not ring true as a Latter-day Saint conversation. Now, if I had to guess what they were trying to do is make these sister missionaries a little bit more relatable as humans. Like, oh, they talk about sex just like us, which is a strange thing to want to fixate on. But also to just introduce their characterization. You've got Barnes, who's a little bit more reserved, skeptical. She's a little more shrewd. And then Paxton, who is the clearly naive, clearly ignorant, bubbly one. And I think they wanted to use a conversation to set that characterization up at the beginning so that Paxton's reveal at the end that she actually doesn't believe, or at least doesn't believe in prayer, comes across as even more shocking. Or the fact that she's the final girl, or the fact that she's ends up being the one who prevails is more of a plot twist, because that one's going to die off easy because she doesn't have any street smarts. But the reality is she is the one who prevails. And so if I had to guess, that's what they're trying to do. But why sex besides just a voyeuristic sort of Mormon exploitation angle to it? I don't quite understand.
Okay, I have two theories. Number one, maybe we're supposed to think that Sister Paxton actually does have a pornography problem because methinks the lady doth protest too much.
But like, why does that matter?
I don't know. It's just adding, oh, these missionaries are not perfect people. I think that is a weaker explanation. My better explanation is that this is, to put it crudely, this is like a grooming tactic for the movie. Saying, hey, we're going to have awkward conversations. We're going to bring stuff up. And it sets you up for another way to think about the main interaction between these two young sister missionaries and Mr. Reed, is that this questioning that he's engaging them in, this bombardment, is a type of rape violation, right? It's against their consent. And so we're bringing up this topic to get you thinking in that way, that this is that kind of movie. And it's not a physical rape. I kept hoping that wasn't going to happen and being worried something sexual was going to happen to these missionaries. It was not. But it is very much a mental kind of violation and rape. You are going to think what I want you to think. And you consent to this, right? You can leave any time. This very much, this talk that you hear from someone who is justifying rape. So that's the way I read it. I don't love it either. But I think it was trying to do that, if you're going to give them credit for being sophisticated about it.
Well, I could potentially see that. And there certainly were a lot of sexual undertones to the beginning of the movie, with both that bus stop conversation and then when her garments are being exposed. Now, it's supposed to elicit your pity and you're supposed to engender sympathy for these characters because she's clearly being bullied. But there's sexual undertones to that. This exploitation of the Mormon fascination with our underwear, which is pretty disgusting. And then it bookends at the end with the scene in the room with the cages where he's talking about her underwear. And that's the code word that starts the final physical conflict. But I felt like there were a little bit of sensual undertones to that exchange at the very end. Like you said, there wasn't actually any rape. There wasn't any sexual violence towards the missionaries, but there was a little bit of an undertone to that scene, I felt.
That's fair. Yeah, if you want to give them credit, which I don't. I'm just more of the opinion that scene is just there to A, humanize them, B, paint them as not actually saints, not, oh, those goody two-shoes, they're just like us, really, it's all a farce. Just making fun of religious people and the facade that they portray. It doesn't seem to occur to Mr. Beck and Mr. Woods that we might actually believe these things and act in our private lives as we speak in our public lives. I don't know. That's my take on the first thing. But this whole sort of conversation gets us into sort of their overall, I don't know, the message of the movie. In this case, do we think that Mr. Reed's attack, trapping the sisters so they have to listen to his monologues? My friend Stephen Smoon, his comment was, I just finished watching Heretic. I gotta say, it's one of the most terrifying horror movies I've ever seen. The idea of being trapped with a Reddit atheist in a snowstorm and being forced to listen to him monologue on religion and philosophy is something straight out of my nightmare. I thought that was quite astute summary of the movie in some ways, and the intellectual rigor that they brought to it, which is to say not a lot. But in this case, is the thesis that Mr. Reed presents to the sister missionaries the actual thesis of the movie itself? Or is there a bigger conversation going on? I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that question.
From what I've been able to hear in previous interviews, it's deliberately ambiguous. They want you to come away with your own conclusion. And maybe some people who have disaffected will end up agreeing with the villain, Mr. Reed. And maybe some people of faith will come away feeling like it was a message of hope and faith. I'm less convinced that really it's what's going on. I do tend to feel like the thesis of the filmmakers is the thesis of Mr. Reed, in the sense that at the end of all of this, Sister Paxton has this illusion that she is finally besting Mr. Reed, that she's trying to push back, figure it out, stand up for herself and her own beliefs against his thesis. But then she discovers that the whole time that was part of the plan, she's been manipulated into this. And it's all about control. And the only way she is able to overcome that and conquer and break away is by embracing her own disbelief, essentially, by using the really disrespectful code word Mormon underwear, and then admitting that she doesn't actually believe in prayer after all. But it's just nice to think about people, and shedding that and having her own mini disaffection of faith is how she's able to overcome and say, no, I'm rejecting this. And so for me, that sends the message that the purpose was to have a critique of organized religion, even if a vague spiritualist faith is a good thing for someone's well-being. And at least based on the reactions I've seen online, it's varied. Some people thought it was pro-faith, some people not. At least from those who have left the faith, their reviews I've seen, they very much think that the filmmakers intended this to be a metaphor for how, yes, religion is bad. Mr. Reed is right, even if he was a bad guy.
I think this is always the problem. There's a big discourse around it in true crime, that true crime is glorifying the bad guy, right? That's who's interesting, is we want to get into the mind of the psychopath and we don't really care about the victim. So then it ends up being about the psychopath's point of view. Is this movie that way? I don't know. I felt like it was more ambiguous as to whether Sister Paxton actually believed what she was saying at the end about prayer not being real. And the only reason I think it's ambiguous about whether she actually does not believe is because when they're up in the chapel at the beginning, she's the one who goes to the disbelief door not because she disbelieves, but because she feels like the best way to deal with this attack is to pretend to go along with it and be like, oh yeah, you convinced us. We no longer believe. We're going to leave through this door, right? So is she doing the same thing again? Because that was always her approach. And her companion tries to convince her that the right way is to just fight and stand up for what you believe because it doesn't matter. He's never going to stop. And does she fully believe that or not? I don't know. It's ambiguous to me as to whether she does lose her faith or didn't have her faith at all. I tend to believe that the movie does not align with Mr. Reed's point of view. I saw a couple of different reviews that use the term post-secular, and before I saw the movie, I was like, what? How is this movie post-secular? I don't know what you're talking about. But post-secular means living in a world where the idea that secularism was going to triumph, that as we got more and more science, religion would eventually fall away. That has been disproven. We have advanced a lot and religion has not gone away. So we have to deal with that. And the secular ideology, the atheist ideology, becomes not the default that everyone will move to, but one among many. And this is saying, hey, look, militant atheism is just as bad as any horror that religion has brought upon the world, right? It's saying this is just one more way that people can behave in a bad way when it's used wrong. I thought it was pointing out, hey, actually secularism, not that great. we use it to control and beat up on religious people and we disrespect them. That was my interpretation, but I can see the other way of interpreting it as well.
Well, and I want to split the difference between the two. I think this is a fun little trio. We seem to be doing this a lot where Jasmin's quite negative towards the movie, and that's okay. And Liz is a little positive towards the movie. And I continue to stick to my thesis, which is they made a good movie on accident because all it would have taken is maybe like one sentence. And I got to say also, if you can find the script somewhere, the script is interesting because I see there was some stuff going on that the writers were intending that didn't end up explicitly in the screen as much. It's interesting to see the sausage being made, so to speak. But at the end, when Sister Paxton is there and she says, the prayer doesn't work. When she says that, she means the way we all knew, and she even uses the line, I believe, prayer isn't like a vending machine. You put in a coin, you get an automatic outcome. I don't think any sincere believer in God really believes that version of prayer. It's the scene from Bruce Almighty where he gets to be God for a day and he just goes to his email and hits reply all and says yes and answers everybody's prayer with a yes. And the next day there's a news article about how 30,000 people won the lottery and so they all get $1.28 or something ridiculous, right? Nobody believes that. So when she's saying, I don't believe in prayer that way, but it does make you a good person, and so I'm going to pray for you. Even as you are crawling towards me to kill me, I am going to pray for you, because that makes her a good person, because she wants to be that kind of person, even though she knows she's not going to put the coin in and get the result that she is saved miraculously. She's going to say the prayer anyway. And although I think Jasmin is correct that the directors intended for it to be weird and ambiguous, I don't think it ended up being as ambiguous as they wanted it to be. And so that's why I'm splitting the difference between Liz's more positive view of this sort of finale moment and Jasmin's more negative one. I will say real quick that as you see what the directors and the writers intend for this movie, at the end of the script itself, they say all descriptions of religious texts, scriptures, artwork, and ceremonial rituals in the screenplay are accurate. The authors would like to acknowledge the following texts that form the foundation of their religious and philosophical research. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's like Flim Flam by James Randi, God is Not Great, John Krakauer, of course, Richard Dawkins.
All our favorites. Greatest hits.
All our favorites, right? The only scholars that they consult, the only secondary literature they consult, to use like an academic term, are all anti-religious stuff. But then they quote the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita and the Book of Mormon and the Bible. They have that as their religious stuff, but they don't engage with any of the secondary literature by believing members of these religions trying to articulate and defend their faith. That shows up obviously in the movie as well. They weren't trying to, which again is why I was pleasantly surprised that the person who survives is the person who, in the end, at least to me, has faith. Actual faith, not that I put a coin in, I get this automatic result, but I have been told to pray to make me a better person and to align my will with God. So even in this moment of intense terror, I am going to do that. And I think accidentally, they make Sister Paxton the hero.
Okay, but we got to talk about two more pieces of the ending. Number one, what happened with Sister Barnes? Is this a miracle? What is going on?
Oh, she just hadn't died yet.
I mean, I've heard interpretations that Sister Paxton had died and the rest of the film was just her near-death experience hallucination. Because there's no way someone who had their throat slit would survive that long to do a final act. But I'd probably lean towards that she just hadn't quite died yet, and she came to for one final effort to save her sister companion.
See, I think you can read it as a miracle. And then when Sister Paxton escapes, the final shot of the film is her kneeling in a grove of trees, and there's a pillar of light behind her. Just saying.
I don't think they were that smart.
I don't know that was intentional, but it read that way to me. Seeing her kneel down and there being trees and just lots of light, it is just a hope and escape kind of thing, but it really does read that way to me.
Yeah. With the script ending, the butterfly appears and lands on her finger, but then doesn't disappear, and her phone is able to connect and she's able to call 911. The actual ending of the movie is way more ambiguous.
It's very Inception-y, right? Oh, is it wobbling? Are they in the dream?
That is exactly the movie that I thought about. And I was like, have the courage of your convictions, you guys. Stick to an ending and pick one. And that goes for you too, Mr. Inception director. Have the courage of your convictions, Christopher Nolan. Pick one.
But I think it actually is a good idea if you're making a film about religion that's like a question of is it true or not, to leave the ambiguous ending is actually sometimes better, because then you don't come down on one side or the other, and people can read it both ways. It doesn't get read as didactic for either side.
Maybe.
I'll tell you another film that this reminded me of. The central trick in the film reminded me of The Prestige.
Oh, yeah. That's a good analogy.
Because when Sister Paxton is trying to figure out what happened with the prophet, the only way it could work is if he has a whole bunch of people. And at first, you as the viewer are like, no, there's no way. And then it's, okay, maybe one. No, this is much worse than you thought. And it's the same thing with The Prestige, which I won't spoil, but similar.
I wanted to get your take on sort of one other point about the movie that I wanted to ask about. You ask in our show notes, Liz, is this Mormon exploitation, right? And I think that the Latter-day Saint missionaries here serve as the religious foils to Mr. Reed's sort of Reddit atheist nonsense. I did love that one moment where Sister Barnes just goes on a diatribe for 90 seconds and it's like, there are major differences. This guy has a freaking head of a bird. This is not the same as Jesus Christ. Don't ignore these differences when you say they're all the same. And I was like, maybe it only deserves a 90 seconds rebuttal because it's actually a nonsensical argument if you actually get into the history of religions and stuff.
Oh, that part was hilarious to me because the argument that the Christian stories echoed throughout mythology is what brought C.S. Lewis to Christianity from atheism.
Right.
So I was like, you could read that either way. That evidence is not as definitive as you think it is.
Mr. Reed having a conversation with C.S. Lewis would have been a lot shorter and a lot more brutal to Mr. Reed, I think.
Indeed.
But anyway, back to my point. I don't know that this movie is specifically against members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I think you could have written this movie about a pair of Jehovah's Witness sisters, and you would have had to change some of the different parts of the religious beliefs or whatever else, or maybe a pair of younger nuns, probably who at least in America would have master's degrees in theology and probably would have done a lot better job than Sister Barnes and Sister Paxton at just going right at him and being like, no, this is nonsense. What are you talking about?
So what you're saying is that the movie required naive, ignorant young girls.
Horror generally does. There's a reason the final girl is the trope, right?
That's true. But I actually think that one of my favorite line from the movie was when they're there in the chapel room and Sister Paxton says, could you go get your wife? He's, oh, sure. Yes, she's right through this door. Then he goes to the door, puts his hand out, and then turns around and says, now, despite the mountain of evidence that you have received that my wife doesn't exist, the candle making the blueberry pie scent, all these things that have happened, if you really believe my wife is here, I will absolutely open this door. But I want you to consider that maybe you were just impressionable when you came in, and I told you I was a wife and I was lying to you, just like when you were young children. When you were impressionable, they told you that God existed, right? I thought that was actually a relatively powerful moment. If it had been a pair of Jehovah's Witness sisters, you could have made that even better with all the failed prophecies of the pre-Jehovah's Witness movement and the fact that they think that Christ appeared in 1914 invisibly and is now ruling the earth. You could have gone after the religious beliefs of different people and still have woven it into Mr. Reed's diatribe against religion as a whole. Was this movie specifically anti-Latter-day Saint, anti-Mormon, or is it just anti-religious in general, and Latter-day Saint missionaries happen to be the foil that they used to represent the religious point?
Maybe because they had some personal connections and things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the overarching point is anti-religious, and Latter-day Saints are just a proxy for that. And missionaries check a lot of boxes for what would serve the purposes of the plot, like being naive and ignorant and young, even though I would reject that as a characterization of Mormon missionaries. You could replace it with another group, but like you mentioned, Liz, there are some personal connections the filmmakers had to the church or to Mormonism. And so I think they had some personal incentives to use that as a lens.
There is a fantastic essay out there by James Goldberg, which I'll have to find and put in the show notes, objecting to the characterization of Mormon missionaries as naive and pointing out how much they're actually involved in real life. When you spend 2 years street contacting people, you meet some people. You know some stories. You're contacting people who are in the worst, hardest parts of their life. You're talking to immigrants. You're talking to people who are down on their luck, who've lost everything, who've gone through divorce. Missionary life is a real wake-up call. It is not a period of naiveness. That's reality. So I love that. I object to the portrayal of LDS missionaries as naive. I have a whole paper on this in The Expanse. So hit me up if you want a copy.
I mean, that's in terms of their street smarts, but also in terms of their understanding of our history and theology.
They get Bible bashed all day, right?
Right. You'd be really hard pressed to find any sort of missionary who wouldn't be aware of the conversations around polygamy. That is just such a common talking point with investigators these days, that these missionaries have had that conversation a million times. It wouldn't have been something that would take them aback as this really uncomfortable, awkward question.
I think this is one problem I have with your point, Carl, that yes, any pair of religious people would do, but I feel like Mormons are particularly useful for the film because of polygamy. Again, if we're characterizing this as a movie that is about rape, but it's a mental, theological rape almost, that we need to have some sort of sexual thing going on here. And the fact that Mr. Reed is a polygamist, he's got a whole harem, actually, that he's keeping. And so that I don't know a ton about Jehovah's Witnesses, but I don't feel like that note would hit as well. Nuns would work because you do have that.
The bride of Christ sort of stuff.
Right. You're the bride of Christ. You're celibate. That kind of note could hit the same thing because there is this emphasis on embodiment. So, but then nuns don't go knocking door to door. And so those 2 points come together in the Mormon missionaries and really work for this film.
There is plenty of anti-Catholic, anti-nun sort of stuff, right? The idea that there are secret tunnels between the nun monastery and the priest monastery that are just filled with corpses of aborted babies. That is a trope that still exists. Oh, you're not actually celibate. You pretend to be all holy and pious. There's always something you could pull in.
There is this intertwining between sexuality and religion that's kind of specific to Mormonism and Catholicism for some reason. Within Christianity, I won't make claims about wider religion.
Fair enough. All right. You've convinced me a little bit. When Pew did a study, this is probably about 15, 16 years ago, the people who most know about their own religion and other people's religions and just religious sort of literacy in general are Latter-day Saints and atheists. And I think that's interesting. And it could have been maybe a little more meatier in the dialogue between the two of them, but between these two sort of factions in this movie, we can call them that.
I actually like that it wasn't meaty dialogue because I think these two sister missionaries represent like the two ways you can respond to Bible bashing, and neither of them is trying to have a reasoned argument, right? Reasoned argument is not the way to approach someone who's bashing your beliefs. You can either A, nod and agree until you can leave, or you can B, just stand up for your faith and testify, but not engage in the conversation, because engaging on an argument level doesn't work. if that's the kind of attitude someone's coming in with. So I actually really thought it was interesting to see the two different missionaries, the two different approaches to dealing with being Bible bashed.
In addition, keeping the dialogue at a pretty sophomoric Reddit level probably made it more palatable for an average audience member who maybe isn't as versed in the theological debates as maybe some of us and other critics of the film have been, because I think a lot of people thought it was interesting. Like, oh, I didn't know that about Mithras. Hugh Grant himself said that in one of his interviews. Oh, all that stuff about Jesus just being a copycat of Mithras and Horus. I didn't know that. That was new to me. And I think that represents a lot of average moviegoers who don't know better. Now, I'm not saying that should persist. I feel that's absolutely inexcusable for such horrendous history to be included in a film like that when that is your central point. But if you had gotten more complex, more sophisticated in the dialogue, you also probably would have lost a lot of audience members.
It would be a different movie.
Sure, it would be a different movie. That's fair. I think the analog to this is another series that we covered on our podcast when we did Midnight Mass, where the key points are just people on a couch talking about what happens when you die. And that beautiful discussion that the one girl does about what happened when she miscarried and how she imagined that the baby just went straight to heaven and met her grandma. And I liked Midnight Mass for a lot of reasons, but one of it was just that the actors did such a good job of articulating all these different various points of view about faith and the afterlife and these sorts of things while this vampire cult is slowly growing in this small seaside town. Spoilers again, sorry. But that they made it interesting just to have two people sitting on a couch talking to each other. And I felt like Hugh Grant's sheer charisma really helped this movie along. If they had gotten a lesser actor to be Mr. Reed, it would absolutely not have worked as well as it did, even if the three of us here, I got a PhD in religion, Liz is a graduate student, and Jasmin works for a nonprofit who does scripture and religion all day, every day. Yeah, we're probably not the target audience for the intellectual rigor that this movie did not exhibit. Was there anybody else or anything else we wanted to bring up?
So some people online have been interpreting the film as being almost like an inverse temple experience or like a hero's journey. What do you guys think about that take?
That gives them way too much credit.
100%. I've listened to interviews with the filmmakers and what their actual understanding of the Mormon religion is, and then reading the script and the sources they drew from. I'm not convinced they actually knew enough about the temple ceremonies to even do that. I don't think they had a fundamental understanding of what the temple ceremonies are trying to accomplish for a member of the church to do that. What is very overtly clear, though, is the imagery of descent is a reference to Dante's Inferno. They flash a poster of Dante's Inferno on the wall. So I feel like that was like a very not subtle way to say, this is what this symbolizes. We're going to go descend to the 7 levels of hell. And there were exactly 7 stations throughout this little house before you get to the bowels of the cage room. So I feel like, if anything, that's what was going on. It was a very on the nose, classic Christian descend to hell trope more than anything else.
Yeah. These guys were so ignorant about the church that they didn't realize that Latter-day Saint elders are always in companionships and aren't 45 or however old Topher Grace is, the actor who plays the one elder who's trying to find the system. Like, if they're that ignorant about something that is so glaringly obvious, missionaries have companions. Is that not like the most obvious symbol of our church worldwide are the 2 people, always 2 people on bikes with name tags, right?
There was a whole musical about it.
Have you seen it?
Yeah, if they're that ignorant about the most basics of our church and our religion, they're not going to get into the nuanced esotericism of the endowment ceremony to accurately reverse engineer it for the purposes of their horror film. That's just giving them way too much credit. But I think it can still be seen as the hero's journey or the descent into hell or something like that. C.S. Lewis again. Those are common themes throughout lots of good storytelling. And again, maybe they accidentally stumbled into that. They made a better movie than they wanted to on accident, right? That's still my thesis and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, I have to agree that you can read it as an endowment. As a Latter-day Saint, I can purposefully read it that way, only because the endowment also shares aspects of the hero's journey, right? Like, it is part of this storytelling because that particular form of story is very powerful. And there's a reason we use those symbols.
If you want to take reader response criticism and just read your own interpretation into it, you can even find endowment imagery in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I don't think that was intentional.
Oh, come on, guys. You're taking down my whole profession of literary criticism. Come on. This is how we make our money that we don't make.
On the point of the missionary, though, I was hearing the writers talk about that point, and they're like, yeah, and people have pointed out that's inaccurate, but we asked all of our Mormon friends and no one could give us a straight answer. And they're like, maybe in this condition or whatever. So we just went with it. And I'm like, no, your Mormon friends are very not participating in the faith. If you had showed any active believing member the role that missionary was going to play, every single one would be like, no, that's not it.
If he's waiting for them to help clean the church and there's only one of him, that's the same thing that they're doing with Mr. Reed, right? They can't be alone with one man. That includes church members, not just investigators.
Yeah, the fact that their research was asking their clearly uninformed Mormon friends just shows the level of surface knowledge they actually had about the religion going into creating this piece of work.
All right. We'll end with our rating segment where we rate the movie in a couple of different ways. Our first rating is content, clean versus objectionable material. And we use the afterlife of the Latter-day Saints to be our guide here. Is this celestial, terrestrial, telestial, or outer darkness? And I'm actually going to ask Jasmin to go first on this one.
Again, I'm not much of a horror viewer. I would probably put it around telestial because it is rated R. It's got adult themes. It does have violence. I've heard that as far as R-rated horror films go, it's less egregiously violent. I wouldn't know. I don't usually watch them, but based on that, I'd probably say it's probably in the telestial realm.
What do you think, Liz?
I was going to go for the exact same. I'm tempted to go to outer darkness because we literally do go to hell, as we just described. And that's as close as Mormons get to hell, so we can go with that. But honestly, content-wise, I felt when we were deciding how we wanted to cover this for the podcast, I was very nervous about seeing it because I don't like horror. And I asked Carl if he thought I could handle it, and he's, yeah, it's about the same level as Midnight Mass. I would actually say it's less than Midnight Mass. In terms of blood, it's mostly just tension. A lot of tension, and then I wouldn't bring anyone impressionable into the film who's going to listen to Mr. Reed's arguments. You need to make sure that your faith is secure before you watch this movie. Good idea. Yeah, so telestial is, I feel comfortable with that.
As the only horror fan among the three of us then, this absolutely was not very violent as opposed to some other horror movies that I've seen, like Alien Romulus I saw recently. This was way more milquetoast compared to that. And so I think telestial is a good place to land for me as well, maybe for different reasons. I certainly think this represents the world in which we now live. And maybe that is a good reason to give it a telestial rating. Our second rating is artistic merit, skillful, effective use of craft, sort of the movie making sorts of things. And we rate it on a scale of 1 to 5 popcorn balls. Liz, why don't you go first on this one? What do you think?
I feel like I'm going to be the outlier on this one since I've been making the case that the filmmakers were intentional this whole time. So I felt like there were some really interesting things that if you were going to watch this film again, you could see, oh, this correlates with this, and there's this theme throughout the whole thing. The film making is really good. The acting is really good. I don't want to give it 5, but I almost feel like I have to, but I'm going to go with 4. Maybe I should give it 5 because I don't like horror, and so I'm mostly discounting it because I don't like horror. So I think it's a very well-made movie. I think I could tell they put a lot of craft into it, even if the research on Latter-day Saint culture is not great.
Or religion in general. I'll go next. I'll give it 4 just because of that aspect. If they had put a couple of scholars of religion who are believers, or even someone like Bart Ehrman, who is not himself a believer but takes belief seriously, would have helped round out the movie in different ways. But absolutely, the acting was all on point. The 2 actresses who played the sister missionaries, both of whom used to be Latter-day Saint but are no longer part of the church, I think they did an excellent job. I really believed that these were 2 Latter-day Saint missionaries, or at least that you could meet Latter-day Saint missionaries who were like this. Again, with the first 2 minutes accepted. Hugh Grant is out of the park. And at least in the movie theater I went to, I could see everything that happened, which is something that doesn't happen in horror movies. Again, Alien Romulus, I'm looking at you, first 5 minutes. What was that? Completely dark theater, and I could not tell what was happening in this movie. And I'm like, you guys, you got to lighten your movies up a little bit. I'll give it 4, but it is interesting to read the script and see some of the things they intended. There's a note at one point, they're like, oh, they're quoting this one guy. The sister missionaries won't know that. And I have a PhD in theology. I did not recognize this particular argument coming from this one thinker. You need to be more explicit about that. And the movie would have been better had they brought some things out that are present in the script, but didn't end up on the screen, if that makes sense. And I'm going to give it 4 popcorn balls. Jasmin, how about you?
I will probably land around 3. I didn't think it was a bad film per se. I did think there was a lot of effort put into costume design, set design. I know a lot of people have been praising the cinematography. Honestly, I felt some of the cinematography was distracting more than helpful to their cause. And what ultimately kills it for me is the accuracy of representing religion and faith that I think in some parts like actually undercuts the story that they're trying to tell. Like, that there's a whole plot point surrounding birth control that just does not exist for Mormons. There's a whole motif around the butterfly and reincarnation that doesn't exist for Latter-day Saints. Like, there's a lot of things that just don't exist in our worldview that they're trying to push forward as important plot elements that I think really just end up undercutting the film being a compelling piece overall.
Yeah. Although I'm going to say about the butterfly and the reincarnation thing, I didn't find that as egregious. I didn't feel like they were necessarily representing that as beliefs of the church. It's just something the Sister Paxton says at some point. My wife has expressed to me multiple occasions that if she dies, she wants to come back as a cat so she can sit in the sunlight and purr and sit on my lap. And I guess she assumes that touch will still be her love language in her next life. Like, Susan doesn't actually believe in reincarnation, but she expressed this thought to me on a couple of occasions. So just because Sister Paxton brought it up once and it ends up being a motif in the last little moments, I don't think they were necessarily saying that was a Latter-day Saint belief. That's just something that someone could say. But I could be wrong, and maybe now for once I'm giving them more credit than they deserve.
Well, I stand corrected on that. Latter-day Saints apparently do want to come back as animals.
At least Sister Paxton and my wife, Susan. Anyway, Susan, just to be clear, does not believe in reincarnation, but she has expressed that to me a couple times. Anyway.
We could do a theological deep dive and find some early Latter-day Saints who did believe in reincarnation. If you've read Elias by Orson F. Whitney, you know what I'm talking about.
It's not a doctrine we currently espouse.
No.
And he was a weirdo, so we love him. He was a weirdo.
Yeah. Just because a Latter-day Saint said it does not mean it is the position of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Anyway, on that note, our last rating is Gospel Connections, morally edifying messages, that sort of thing. Scale of 1 to 5 apricots. I'll go first this time. I'm going to give it 4 apricots, and I wish it had been 5. If they had brought a little more nuance into it, if they had stuck a little more to the better ending that existed in the script where she actually connects to 911. And it's clear that she's in the real world. This could have been a better movie, maybe a little less Reddit atheism, but more good atheism, that which exists out there. This could have been an interesting movie. And as it is, we've obviously had a lot of conversation between the 3 of us. And so I think you can have a good conversation about these sorts of things. I do like that Sister Paxton ends up being the only survivor, the only person who really becomes a saint at the end to pray for her enemy, as he's literally crawling towards her to kill her. There are some things that I appreciated about this movie. I'm going to give it 4 apricots. Again, I think that was an accident, but it's still there. Who would like to go next, Liz or Jasmin?
I'll give it 2 apricots. It's a redemptive story at the end. Goodness triumphs. It came across to me as anti-religious, but pro some sort of vague faith. And I ultimately think that faith is a good thing, and that in our increasingly secular world, that to have a story that says having a belief in some sort of higher power or something beyond yourself or being selfless is a virtue. I think that's a positive message. I wish it had not come at the expense of violence against missionaries and trying to tear down structured religion as an inherently more negative thing. But yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Sure. Certainly ends up at least spiritual, but not religious. Okay. Like, I think the directors would be comfortable with that sentence. And as members of our organized religion, I think we disagree. But yeah. Anyway, Liz, what do you give it?
I'll split the difference between you and give it a 3. for different reasons. I feel like this movie sparked a good conversation between us three because we are so religiously literate, right? And even generally literate. If I hadn't studied the concept of post-secularism, I don't think I would have understood this movie well, and I don't think there are many people who study the concept of post-secularism, see previous comments about English majors and no money. I just think it can be a really good conversation piece if you are at a level where you can step back from the film, not be dragged down by Reddit atheism, CS letter embodied. You have to be at a certain place to have this conversation and have this movie be a good way to have it, if that makes sense. If you're there, it works, but I wouldn't recommend it to your average member of the church, right? And I wouldn't recommend it to your average theater goer as, here's a good way to think about how atheism and religion interact with each other. Maybe it will work. Maybe it will just be a horror film for you to watch. I know that one of the people I watched the movie in the theater with came out and she turned to me, a complete stranger, and said, that movie was dumb, wasn't it? And I was like, interesting. I don't know what her relationship to the church was. This was in Orem. So I don't know if the mainstream audience is really going to get what this film can provide. But it can provide good conversation if you're at the level for it.
That's fair.
I'll also add that I think one positive thing the film does as far as like virtue and praiseworthy is the depiction of the missionaries themselves is less caricatured than we've seen in previous depictions in media. They're the protagonists. They clearly have like emotional depth. They have sympathy of the audience. They have character development, and they're not necessarily completely just these strange, weird Mormons. They have the weird Mormon moments, and they have the you guys are really naive moments, and that's just the way you are. And so I don't love that. But overall, this is a decently humanized portrayal of Latter-day Saint missionaries, and I think that's a net good.
Yeah.
I was also thinking, I think this is the first time we see a mainstream depiction of sister missionaries. It's almost exclusively elder missionaries, right? Book of Mormon musical is all men. Are there any depictions of sister missionaries in mainstream culture? I don't think so.
I think you're probably right. Of course, the movie required that because you couldn't leave the message that religion's a misogynistic scam if the men were the ones who were the victims.
Yes.
Yeah, not to mention that it's very different when the two elder missionaries are trapped and they're like, okay, this guy is being creepy and let's just break the door down and go. The dynamics shift incredibly that way.
Has Mr. Reed just been like sending interest things to the church every once in a while? When the elders show up at his door, he's like, dang, wrong house, guys. Waiting for the pair of sister missionaries to be in the area.
That was one part of the narrative aspect that raised my eyebrows. What was the whole point of this? Why are you even collecting these women in cages? Do you live in this house, or is this just a set for you? Why? What was the point of all of this overall? For you to just kill them and then the police to eventually figure it out and come arrest you? You were broadcasting your genius thesis to the internet. You were just demonstrating to these two terrorized girls. They never answered those questions, and I feel like it fell flat that way.
I feel like that's part of horror. You can't explain too much without it falling apart. So horror is a genre where you have to leave a lot unexplained. Or you destroy the horrifying nature of it, the ununderstandable nature of it.
So that's an interesting thesis, and I'm trying to say this without sounding arrogant. People who are more religiously literate and who are more literate in general might have a better conversation about this movie than your average person. That seems fair.
I think a lot of it has to do with the pacing. I've seen some secular reviewers praise it because it was such an unexpected pacing of the film that the bulk of it is like monologuing, and it's this intellectual debate building tension, and you don't even get to the more traditional rhythm of horror slashing action until the very end of the film. But I think that is what also had it fall flat for some viewers who were expecting a more traditional rhythm of the horror genre. And then we're just like sitting listening to a lecture for half of a movie.
If you want a example of the horror genre that deals with religious themes through monologuing, may I suggest Midnight Mass? You can go watch that on Netflix. It's by Michael Flanagan, who himself is a former Catholic. but who takes it really seriously. And I think I highly recommend Midnight Mass. And then you can go listen to our episode on it, which I thought was fun. But good show, long show. Liz, where can people find you if they'd like to get in touch with you?
You can find my writing and book reviews on lizbusby.com.
All right. And I am on Threads at Carl Cranny. Jasmin, where can people find you if they'd like to get in touch?
You can find me with the handle Scripture Plus on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X.
And I got to say, as far as plugging stuff, back to the sort of a conversation about the temple ceremony and the hero's journey and these sorts of stories that we tell and how it gets integrated. Your YouTube channel, what is it, Temple Light? Yeah, and your temple prep stuff is really good. I wish I had watched all of that before I went through the temple for the first time.
Well, thanks. That's really kind.
Thanks for joining us this week. If you've enjoyed this episode, share the podcast with a friend who enjoys good movies and good conversation. You can also subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice or on YouTube. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode via email, social media, or on our website. It really makes our day as podcast hosts to hear from you. This has been Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, encouraging you to seek after everything virtuous, lovely, of good report, or praiseworthy. See you next time.